don't know if this little meme is true in the sense of we all heard this proverbial frog jumps into a hot pot and he jumps back out of it, but you put him in a cold water and then you turn up the heat, he'll boil to death. I think that's in our experience when we left the States, there's only so much you can see in your own culture and you need fresh eyes. So when we came back from living overseas and re-entered into ministry in the US, we saw things very differently. We re-entered and we realized that there is a blindness that a person develops because they're immersed in their culture, and it takes some outside eyes, some external eyes to be able to see that. And so when I re-entered the culture, I of course reinserted right into the typical women's Bible study program where you studied a semester at a time, maybe different books of the Bible, different characters of the Bible, or so on. And I had several women who I knew loved God. They loved God's word. They were faithful students of God's story, and yet of God's word, what they knew. And yet they left their husbands and their children and abandoned their marriages. That really sent me into a tailspin because I thought, how could people study the Bible this intentionally and still walk away and do the things they do? And I realized that we had a Bible literacy challenge before us because understanding God and his ways is only revealed through understanding the meta narrative of the Bible. And I felt it was critical to go back to understand what is panoramically, what is taking place in the developing story of the Bible, because it's through the entire story that God reveals his character, his nature, his promises, his prohibitions, how he works, his strategy, how he teaches his people to walk with him by faith. And fundamentally, it's a relationship. So I think doing Bible study, you can get lost in the minutia of doing Bible study and not encounter God.
You know, the same thing happened to my wife and I when we came back from Russia. We spent a few years in Moscow, Russia, as missionaries. And I remember palpably the grief that we had and the mourning that we went through when we came back to our church and we realized what was happening, and we saw the way they were studying the Bible, and we really were changed. Like Iva said, there's really no way for you to see inside your own culture until you get outside of it. But there's something a little bit more that happens that she didn't mention. When you spend 100% of your time laying down your life for the gospel. In other words, when you live the kind of life that says, I'm going to walk out the door today and I'm not coming back until I've shared the gospel with people. When you live that kind of life, you inevitably see God work in ways that you had no idea when you weren't living your life that way. Mm-hmm. I tell folks, if you want to see a miracle, just get involved in evangelism. Mm-hmm. But we saw we saw a God that was different than our commercialized American church version that we had before we left. And we saw the God of the Bible. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is our God. The God that moved to plant churches under Paul's leadership. The God that gave the gospel success when Paul and Barnabas went and preached. He is our God, and he's never changed. And so coming back and noticing that people in the American church study the Bible for decades and yet never get to the place where they are consistently sharing the gospel with people every week. Some confess they cannot share the gospel. This is deeply, deeply troubling.
Well, I have two quick responses to that I really think we need to nail down. The first is that we made it about 10 minutes into the very first episode before Joel had to drop I was a missionary to Russia. It just, for those of you who don't, just everyone, so he'll just throw in a Russian word, just a little reference, like, well, when I was in Russia.
Well, let me tell you something. There was a woman that did some counseling for us. In other words, she counseled us. We needed counsel. Mm-hmm. And her first opening conversation with us, she looked us in the eye and she said, I'm not impressed that you're missionaries. And I love that woman.
Well, I want to say, I am impressed that they are missionaries, but I do think that the experience you're talking about, getting outside your culture, part of that is that you're seeing it with new eyes. Another aspect of that is that sometimes in our own culture, we get so used to not asking questions or not being asked questions ourselves, because in our culture, it is very impolite to ask a question you don't already know the answer to. But see, I'm in student ministry, and kids and teenagers will ask anything and everything with no censor. And so what you find out right away is that if I'm doing a Bible study full of adults, I don't have to worry about the questions that they ask me, because they're all going to be softballs. They're all going to be really easy, simple answers 90% of the time. But if you get in a room with 13-year-olds and you say, hey, ask me anything about the Bible, they're going to ask about the most obscure things. They're going to ask about the character of God in ways. They're going to ask about things, and you're like, I've never been asked about anything like that before. And so you have to know and be able to piece together that whole story, because, an adult will never look you in the eye and have a series of questions like this. Well, do you love Jesus? And if people die without Jesus, do they go to hell? Like, yeah. Well, then how come you aren't telling everyone about Jesus? Like, adults won't do that. 13-year-olds will straight up do that. They'll be like, did you lead anyone to the Lord today? Well, what's wrong with you? I thought, and it's just amazing, that idea that every once in a while we get shocked into realizing the problem of Bible literacy within our own culture.
So I got to drop another missionary bomb. There was a time when I was a missionary.
Oh,
and
I've never heard that before.
And anyway, we were deeply involved in sharing the gospel with as many people as possible. As a result of meeting us, of course, they should hear the gospel, and then we wanted to invite them into long-term exposure into God's word. Mm-hmm. The Russians are incredibly literate people, and so one day, my big aha moment, we have a Bible literacy problem. A colleague of mine had shared the gospel with a Russian gentleman, and that Russian gentleman went home and started reading the Bible in Genesis. And he got to Leviticus, and he came back and he started asking questions. And my colleague had no idea what to do with his questions. Couldn't explain the big story of God, and had a natural instinct from his American church training to really just get his Russian friend out of Leviticus and get him into the New Testament. Mm-hmm. And I think this really highlights the central problem, because we don't know what to do with the Old Testament many times, because we grow up studying the Bible, in bits and pieces. Yeah. We read devotions, 3 or 4 verses, and then we read 3 paragraphs of what some author says. And I found that really, as we unpack this problem, we tend, if we're not careful, to treat the Bible like a dictionary or an encyclopedia. Mm-hmm. But in fact, the Bible is a story. It is a historical account of Creator God interacting into human history, speaking and then carrying out his purposes and his plan in real time. And he's and while he's doing that, he's revealing his character, and he's revealing our brokenness and our need for forgiveness, for redemption, for atonement. And so, bottom line, I love what happened in Iva's life. In fact, if it weren't for Iva May, my life would be completely different right now. So I love hearing these early stories from when God started this whole work.